Can you hear me? Okay, so this is the final bit. I'm going to tell you how this is going to go and how it's not going to go. I already told you I'm the undereducated guy from South Louisiana, so there will be very little brilliance coming out of my mouth. I am going to, however, read some very intelligent questions that some people wrote for me to ask Dr. Frincke, because she's the smart one, as indicated by doctor in the front. There will never be a doctor in front of my name. So we'll see how this goes. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you for doing this as a fireside chat. I thought at this point of the day you'd probably prefer that to my giving you about a 20-sheet page worth of PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Good speaker points.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so we talked a lot today about the importance of AI in the future of delivering the federal mission. Can you talk a little more about specifically how AI is shaping the intelligence community?
Now, what's interesting is the intelligence agencies have been using AI for a long time, and it probably doesn't surprise anybody here because you've been hearing throughout the day about what it takes to do AI well. Big computers, we got a couple of computers, pretty big ones, a lot of investment in infrastructure. Data, we have all kinds of data, and we have a clear mission. So when you have those three things put together, the rise of the algorithms that let you use them more effectively has made it a lot more possible for us to use AI in a number of places. So there's spots in my agency we've been using AI for getting on to 20 years, and there's other places where it's newer. And so I'd say the sky's the limit in terms of how we can advance our mission to get ahead of the adversary as they grow and change. Now, something that's different about our mission from some of the ones you've been hearing has to do with the kind of data that we've got. I don't mean the classified nature of it. I mean the fact that it's noisy, ugly, and people aren't all that willing, the ones we gather it from, to help us clean it up. And so this idea of having an absolutely pristine data set to work from is not there. And also, absolute truth. In our business, we're all about reducing risk and uncertainty, but that rarely means that we get to absolute truth. So some of the techniques that work well in other organizations, we have to find other ways around.
Can you expand on that a little bit, especially with the lack of pristine data? And so how do you deal with that then?
So partly it's a special sauce, but I'll give you some of the parts that I think will apply to the more of the people in the room. So one of the things that helps you reduce uncertainty anywhere is to get a lot of smart eyes on a problem. One of our better machine learning approaches to leveraging large data, and I won't tell you the application because I don't think that's so important, just the structure of it, is by having it regularly updated. So we trained on a large data set, as is usually the case. We did our best to identify what was accurate and what was not accurate, and we ran it. We put that in front of analysts. Now, we gave the analysts something that I haven't seen in a lot of models, but is turning out to be a best practice for us, and that is to let the analysts, when they look at a finding or a recommendation or whatever the outcome of the system is, to say yay or nay, thumbs up, thumbs down. So in essence, we added training in by a large crowdsourced, very smart group of people to look at what they think absolute truth is in a context and allow them the ability to remark, so to speak, so that if our learning algorithm in the model that we have wasn't as accurate as we would like, they can improve that. And so over time, it gets to be very strong. And then, of course, we have to propagate those models out on a regular basis. It's a lot faster than every 6 months because we're dealing with an adversary that's, of course, trying to fly under the radar. So a little bit of a spy versus, actually, there's a lot of a spy versus spy there. I didn't really mean that pun.
So what AI capabilities do you think are most transformative in the IC? And then, so in the IC and then in the federal government in general. So one of the things I think that we see occurring is we see a lot of the C-level folks are tasking their organization with, go figure out AI. And then there's this gap in understanding and education about not only what AI is, but what are my practical use cases and how do I get started in that, right? So can you talk a little bit about the use cases in the IC and then your thoughts on outside?
I would say that last piece may be where you can get the biggest bang for your buck initially with AI, data science, machine learning, wherever you decide to start, whatever your favorite word is to use for that, is the education and training process and finding out what makes a good use case in your situation and what doesn't make a good use case in your situation. If you have a lot of data, but you don't have smart people who can help you get to ground truth, the AI system might give you a mechanical answer, but it's not necessarily going to give you something that you want to work with in terms of accuracy. If, on the other hand, you have a way to work around that uncertainty, that can help. I think I heard mentioned earlier a couple of times the importance of teaming in this space. So after education and training, finding good ways to get your experts to understand how to work with those who are coming from a background that helps them understand the technology. So we have, for instance, in Research Directorate, a lot of experts in data science and mathematics and certain of the depth technologies, cybersecurity and the like. The most effective teams we have are when our people work with capabilities, lots of depth in infrastructure, properly leveraging the high-performance computing, and operations working together tightly to identify a next step. So those are really important. And then one has to think about a point I haven't heard made except lightly a few times. I think the last talk you mentioned how you were handling it, though. It's the life cycle. So very few things in this space are going to be just one and done. We might come up with a short prototype to see if something's within the realm of the possible. But if you're going to field AI, chances are you're going to want to use it for a long time. And so you have to have a way of continuing to understand your model. That means you need to maintain your experts, both in the area and in using the model to get the job done, which is now a new thing you've co-created, and then ways to continue to refresh, checking the accuracy, checking the standards to make sure you're getting the outcomes that you want.
Awesome. Thank you. So many of the attendees today are from agencies across the federal government. From your perspective, what questions should agencies be thinking through as they seek ways to incorporate AI into their operations? And if you can talk a little bit about what tools are available to them and where do they find the people? So I think one of the big challenges we're all grappling with is where do you find the people and what are those people?
I think that again is going to continue to be the hardest part. It's just what we say about cyber too, isn't it? We're developing a whole new thing. Yep. So without wanting to offend anyone in this room, the first question, the very first question you should ask yourself when you look at is AI right for you is AI right for this? Are you just picking it up because you've been told that this is the right solution, or is this something that's going to really help? Because sometimes we see people wanting to use machine learning in areas where you can, or a complicated machine learning in places where an expert system or a checkbox actually does work effectively. So if you can do something simple within your usual processes, you probably won't want to go there. The next thing you should ask yourself is how much change are you willing to take on board? And this is really part of any new innovation. You know, Horizon 1 innovations, where we talk about leveraging our own infrastructure, the existing infrastructure better. We call the Horizon 3, the disruptive innovations, disruptive for a reason. It's going to change things a lot. And so if your organization, if you look yourself in the mirror, you and your organization, and say, we're not ready to change significantly, then you should probably stay with smaller uses of AI, machine learning that helps you do things you're doing today more efficiently, more effectively, the people, and so on, and then move from there. The people that you have will determine how far you're going to be willing to go. A lot of what my organization does is look at what's truly transformational, but some of it is too early, and some of it actually really does work and is transformational, and then we work with the organizational change. But you need to be honest with yourself about how much organizational change can your individual unit sustain. And how quickly. And then the manageability of it, as well as maintaining compliance, and the rest are especially important in government.
Any thoughts on the tools available?
There's so many. I have to say, it sounds horrible. We tend to roll a lot of our own because we're very specialized, and because, again, we need to design compliance in. But I think the speaker before the last one listed a lot of great ones. TensorFlow, for instance, is one that I see people use a lot. This is a case where I would work with your IT department and decide how much are you going to invest. Foot stomping, an earlier comment, make sure you have enough horsepower to deal with the number crunching, the algorithmic approach that you're using. And as well, it may go without saying, you better be able to manage the level of data you want to gather and maintain. So get some feel for how much data storage you need and how you're going to maintain that. That's sometimes a gotcha for people that think through the computational power and then they realize they can't keep maybe but a few weeks worth of data at the volumes that are coming at us.
Yeah. So, you may want to modify your answer to this, but what are the most pressing policy type concerns around AI that agency leaders should keep in mind?
Okay, so I try to stay away from policy, being a researcher, and leave that to the others. But there are some things that I mention to our policymakers, so maybe that'll serve. So I mentioned one of them, the manageability of it. Whether it needs to be a policy or not, policy with a big P in terms of government policy or a local internal policy, you really do need to have a management policy in place for any critical AI you put together. Again, you're not likely to buy it once and then be done with it. You're probably going to be managing it for a while. So you have all of those manageability activities that come with, do you know what model you're using? When was the last time you assessed it? That was a wonderful discussion of how one updates models that I was hearing. How are you going to manage that and even understand if a decision is made with that model that is questioned in court? So there's an understandability aspect of it, and I think that that will be more important in some areas rather than others. If we are to explain, we government need to be transparent with the American people. That includes helping them understand how decisions were made. When the decisions are made based on a model, mathematics, deep, that's going to require a different level of fidelity. There's something we've begun to refer to as ethical AI. And that's one that, whether we think of that as policy or not, that's an area we all need to consider. The question of bias that negatively impacts some of our fellow citizens, that is crucial. We have to look for that. There are other kinds of ethical AI we need to think as well. Some of the algorithms we look at, for instance, are potentially reverse engineerable. So are you able to properly screen the privacy of those who might have self-generated the data? Or from our agency's standpoint, from the intelligence community, are we revealing more than we want to reveal if somebody were to gain access to a model? So that's important. And then I would be remiss if I didn't say AI security. AI security, this is a brand new field in terms of adversarial action. And while most of you may not have to deal with that, we and the DoD need to be understanding that an adversary, a smart adversary who also has AI, computational power and the like, is likely to be scrutinizing what we do to see if they can take advantage to use even simple things like sensor binding and arrest. So those are the areas I would recommend that we take a look at, especially the ethical, the understandability, what is needed for accountability, and then the AI security.
So can you expand a little bit on how do we, as a nation, get where we need to be in this technology when the adversaries don't have the same ethical or privacy concerns that we do? You have any thoughts on how we do better?
You know, I think that's something we're all wrestling with in various contexts, isn't it? How do we do better in a state where the adversaries might be able to look at more data? I think I've got more answers of what not to do than what to do. What not to do is to become something that we're not. We are the United States of America. We are a proud free people. We are a proud free people. We believe in democracy and sharing and openness. And we should not ever lock ourselves down to the point where we lose that. That said, we can use common sense. There are some kinds of investigations and some kinds of algorithms that shouldn't be shown in the public. Some of our data I would not want to put out in public, as much as I love using open source, and I will when I can put technology in open source. So sharing where you can, but really thinking through what the harm is if something's inadvertently revealed. And then again, foot stomping the ethical aspect of it. Really thinking through what as a nation makes sense in terms of protecting those people whose data may be helpful to our various missions, whether it's health, other kinds of defense, others that might come to your mind. What is it that we need to share for the common good? And what is going to be too precious or potentially too harmful to individuals that we'd want to possibly reveal? So as we get more confidence in the algorithms and our ability to handle those and have them screen the data underneath, and there are researchers making progress in that area, we can share more. But for now, I think just being very careful and diligent about what we're gathering, what the impact is. I love the things we can do with AI, but sometimes it worries me when I see a rush to use without thinking through the data management issue and the impact on others if there's any kind of a mishandling.
Can you referenced what I call algorithmic bias. Can you give the audience some examples of algorithmic bias and how that shows up?
Okay.
That's applicable to this audience,
Right.
not necessarily your world.
I'll make one up. How's that? Let's suppose we're dealing with accidents, and it just so happens that there's only one crazy gray-haired lady in the federal government who goes rock climbing, and she so far this hasn't happened, but maybe she has a lot of accidents. But the other ones might be very careful. We just don't have data on them. the machine learning algorithm that's going to come up with a prediction of what is this person's injury likelihood is going to be a lot higher because we only have one individual, a small number of people. So in a sense, it's prejudicial against older female rock climbers. And so there'd be no way to address that if you don't think to look for, are we treating our older female rock climbers differently than others? And so when you think about populations that are very small, or if diversity of a community isn't great enough to give you some kind of equivalence of numbers, or if there's been an inherent bias against certain groups in a system, those things, a straight line machine learning algorithm that's simply looking at what's been true might actually build in outcomes that we don't want. So those would be the examples. Just think about the gray-haired female rock climbers. We don't want to be mean to them, and that'll get you in good shape.
How about we'll call you a youthful gray-haired female rock climber
There you go.
going forward as opposed to
Whatever
an
you
older.
like.
Can you share an overview of the intelligence community's re-aim framework?
Yes.
And how's your team using the reference architectures in your work at?
And I'm pretty excited about that. So we take that approach up to the next level. A lot of times when we talk about organizational transformation, we do zero in on what is the specific infrastructure we need to use in order to do what we're going to do. What I like about what the intelligence community has done is they've stepped it up to the next level, which is, as an intelligence community, as all of us work together, our organization, our sister organizations, what is that underpinning, that infrastructure that we all think is going to be needed to be successful? So the first principle behind Director Coates and PDD&I, Gordon's description to us about what they wanted out of AIM was that it needed to affect multiple parts of the intelligence community. So they weren't interested in things that just affected one. So it's just an NSA approach. But what are those multi-int ways? How do we combine, for instance, to support that need to share, that sharing of finding different tricky needles in the haystack altogether? So that's built in as a foundation. And we have some pieces of the AIM imperative that are going to be intended to look at challenges that will help us get that right. A second thing we looked at is the digital foundation. So as we think through those multi-int challenges that involve more than one organization, what are the foundations? So as we go forward and somebody asks me this question downstream, I'd be able to say, oh, go right to the AIM center that stood up, and they will tell you the kinds of infrastructures that have worked the best for the kinds of reference problems that you have.
Great.
We included something that not everyone does, but I really recommend it. Admittedly, I'm biased. Research. So this is... As long as this field's been around, there is still a tremendous amount that we don't know. And so one of the core elements of AIM, in fact, some of the earliest people working on putting that together, were the researchers thinking through what's the next generation, and then also policy issues. What are those things we jointly need to address together? Again, I dodged that one a bit because of being research policy people, though, need to work that, we inform. And then the incredibly important talent problem, workforce. So how do we identify the right kinds of people and teams? How do we get them trained? How do we deal with people that may be concerned about AI edging them out of their job? How do we help them be empowered wherever possible, or find them things that are meaningful if that's the better approach? So all of that is designed in. It's formally launching any time now. It depends on what you consider to be a formal launch. It's at least been discussed in public, and I'm really happy about the approach we're taking.
Outstanding. Thank you. Are there any use cases or applications of actual AI and machine learning that you can share with us?
My favorites are all classified. I can tell you that in research I can tell you part of this, we were called in to help a few years ago to protect the Olympics. So it would have been a tragedy to have something happen to the athletes there. So we were able to use machine learning approaches to do traffic analysis and patterns to see if we could identify anything that might have indicated a move in that end. I had to sweat bullets to get that one pulled out, but that's part of what we do. Perhaps an easier one to describe is more forward-leaning. Everyone talks about the cyber problem. We also are responsible for doing things about it, both defensively and then in tandem with supporting DoD, not to exclude Cyber Command, the special relationship there. But one of the things we're looking at with AI is how does one design more effective self-protecting systems? Can we use things such as deliberate deception of an adversary, trying to enter that to make them self-protecting and self-healing? And so that's an area we've been pushing forward on.
So I'm glad you brought up cyber, because I believe there's, you all have your own use cases, DoD has their own use cases, every civilian agency will have their own specific use cases. for AI and machine learning, but where it's not a specific agency thing is cyber. Cyber cuts across everything, obviously, and so AI-enabled cyber solutions, I think, will be easy for any agency, civilian or otherwise, to take on in terms of a project. So in that vein, do you have any thoughts on what specific workloads any of the non-DoD and intel agencies should be looking at?
In terms of cyber specifically?
Whatever,
yeah.
wherever.
In terms of, what do you mean by workload in that?
So use cases.
Oh,
maybe a
okay,
better
use
place.
cases.
Yeah,
So,
use cases.
well, especially in terms of cyber, there's room for a lot of people to help defend. We understand in some sense how things should work with the DoD systems, but every one of us has got a home, a personal home, and there's a lot more critical infrastructure than telecommunications networks and cyber, and so there's a ways to go. So I think that's an area where the more of the easy work can be handled by other agencies than ourselves, so that we can stick with things like nation state, that's very helpful. Cyber falls in the range of the areas that are difficult. Researchers have been trying to use cyber, in some cases effectively, for a lot of years. So if there are areas where you can do machine learning, say to understand what normal looks like in your environment, good use of anomaly detection, those types of things, that makes you hardened against a lot of the external threats, and that would make it easier for DoD, Cyber Command, the like, to dive in where it's necessary. In terms of other workload, from governmental standpoint, we all have this need to do more all the time. I know that when we stepped back to the previous director in the IC, he talked about this as the most complex environment he'd ever seen for the intelligence community. I don't think it's gotten any simpler in the last couple of years, but that's true for every single agency. So looking through to see where you can make use of machine learning at a right size and then the right amount of change, and getting used to it, starting a little smaller and building up, or if you're more used to it, moving forward. So I hate to give a specific workload. There's a lot we can do with AI, but just think it through carefully so you won't wind up in a worse mess. The single thing I'd ask you not to do is please don't make an AI system and then lose your last expert in the area. It is a whole lot easier to keep those things on course if you have a healthy expert population. So I think someone else said this as well. Build your experts up so you at least have a few, and then use the augmenting of the intelligence with the machines to help expand their impact, and that's a more effective collaboration for most.
Awesome. So we have a little less than 10 minutes left. I'll pull one more question, and then maybe we can do some Q&A with the audience. So many agencies struggle with the adoption of any new technology. There's, especially at the leading edge of it, there's budgetary, there's contract challenges, right? There's obviously people and organizational challenges that come along with all of that. So do you have any recommendations for how, or lessons learned to how you all overcame those barriers, or how the agencies that are not as far advanced can overcome those challenges?
It depends a bit under how much time crunch you are to make the change, because what we found is the most effective really does start with a people-to-people, that human connection between someone who understands the problem really well, as an expert in it, a researcher, data scientist, a team that knows how to apply the science, and then a capabilities expert. You're absolutely right that the business, I should have mentioned, is also part of the challenge. Figuring out how we can obtain product, especially on our side, from smaller organizations. One or two of you might have found it a little tricky to deal with federal acquisitions process. Possibly. No one in this room experiences that, but it can be rather daunting if you are a small company and you have a phenomenal product to sell. It would be a shame to lose that. So if there'd be one thing that I would recommend we look at in how we examine acquisitions, is how can we get that one great idea that just happens to be small and maybe not a place that can sustain it over time, which is easier for us to deal with, and get them in the mix too. So that would be critical. But seriously, starting with that understanding of your problem space and building the solid team, and then nurturing them and building it up over time, proving that it works, putting the compliance and the regulations that you need to meet in place, really crucial.
Awesome. So let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Do we have a mic? Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Hi. Sidney Friedberg, Breaking Defense, reporter and therefore professional loudmouth. One of the threads that's gone through this, I'll be less loud now. On the one hand, there's this tremendous ferment of open source and commercial and open architecture and things that are out there for the taking that are far beyond anything the government or the security sector writ large could fund, let alone DOD or NSA or any one agency. On the other hand, there are places where the Venn diagram of security and commercial sector problems doesn't overlap, where you have to worry more than the commercial sector about, as you said, malicious manipulation of the data or people trying to reverse engineer algorithm from the data set and figure out the breakpoints. AI can be tricked, at least for now, in ways that no human brain would be vulnerable to. So, to what degree can you apply some commercial knowledge and translate it for such military-specific problems like the malicious AI, malicious data problem? To what degree do you have to really, invest your very limited in-house dollars on unique research for unique, IC defense needs?
It's a really good question. If somebody else can do it, I don't want to be doing it in research. We have a limited number of people that are extraordinary, and I want to apply them to the hardest problems. And if somebody else has solved it, then I'm very delighted to use their brilliant people and their resources. So it's certainly something we look towards. The bright spot is that quite often the thing that makes an AI or machine learning solution special, once one understands whether or not the algorithm can be reverse engineered, which is a different problem, is the data you feed to it. So there's more sharing than you might think between federal government, even sensitive agencies in terms of drawing on the kinds of algorithms that are developed outside. We fund universities. I have a laboratory, and it's got a SCIF in it, a secure classified infrastructure in North Carolina State. It is there partly because we want to be in the middle of an ecosystem that's very rich with students. A lot of academics of various kinds will come there as well, and local business. It lets us learn from what they're doing. So we can look at the published algorithms. We can often use those in-house. Sometimes a re-implementation is needed. Sometimes a re-examination for security is needed. We can often use that. What we find would be harder would be the data. The data is precious and is the lifeblood, and so the models need to be shared with more care. But in terms of some of the special analytics, it's better than you might think. We can also clear people when we need to. I mean, that isn't going to be a bulk solution, but you can bring people in under clearance if they can pass muster and have them give advice. And then frankly, a lot of us are still at the stages, a lot of federal organizations, where there are best practices we can learn from one another. So going to an event like this, where I'm hearing about best practices that others have used, so those are shareable openly. But there always will be some places where we accept the inability to use something from the outside because of security reasons. That's correct.
But without going back to the audience, in the interest of time, we have just a few minutes left. Are you all doing anything around RPA, robotic process automation, which is not necessarily AI, but frequently closely linked?
Now, there's a lot of people in the IC that are looking at robotics. I have some. It's not mainly aimed at process automation. It actually was intended to help the differently abled participate in meetings. So I have a bot that can be manipulated remotely and can go into meetings and trundle down the halls, and we've used it in multiple scenarios for that. So we do have some of that kind of work. There's a little less in terms of process aiding that we need to do out of my organization.
Outstanding. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks very much.
It's been incredibly valuable.